大家好，最近股市动荡的非常厉害，我觉得可以坐下来静一静。耶鲁大学基金的 David Swensen 最近去世了，所以做了这么一期视频做个纪念，同时收录了一些 Peter 林奇的谈话，这两个人都是投资界的绝顶高手，希望对大家有启发。为什么投资界非常尊崇 David Swensen 呢？因为他没有人云亦云，没有亦步亦趋的模仿他人，而是大胆地走出了一条自己的投资模式，而且取得了成功。
But if you think about those endowment allocations that I saw in the mid-1980s, 40% of the assets were in bonds and cash, which are low expected return assets. Me and my colleagues to go down a different path to put together a portfolio that had reasonable exposure to equities and put together a portfolio that was sensibly diversified.
这是目前耶鲁大学基金的资产配置，我们可以看到债券和现金只占10%左右，而不是他80年代接管基金的时候的40%。这张图表明他的资产配置相当多元化，其中有一点我想补充说明的是，你看他大约有20%的资金投在私募公司上面，这里面有很多是耶鲁大学的成功校友，遇到非常好的投资机会的时候会告诉母校的基金，这种独特的资源是散户模仿不了的。
And one of the first things that you learn is that diversification is a great thing. New York Times reporter asked Jim to explain in layman's terms what it was that he won the Nobel Prize for. Jim said, well, I guess you could say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I didn't know you got a Nobel Prize for that. If you diversify your portfolio for a given level of return, you can generate that return at lower risk. If you diversify for a given level of risk, you can generate higher returns. So diversification is this great thing. It's a free lunch. It's something that everybody should embrace.
有人可能会说，谁不知道投资要多元化呢？须知，正如他刚才说的，上世纪80年代的时候，大多数大学基金都把40%以上的资金投资在债券和现金市场里面。为什么呢？
What it is that I'm going to talk about, but the most profound example remains around the Great Crash in 1929. And if you'd had your whole portfolio in small stocks at the peak, by the end of 1929, you would have lost 54% of your money. By the end of 1930, you would have lost 38% of your money, another 38%, that is. By the end of 1931, you would have lost another 50%. And by June of 1932, for good measure, you would have lost another 32%. So for every dollar that you had at the peak, at the trough, you would have had 10 cents left.
80年代的时候，大多数大学基金把40%的资金投在债券和现金上的主要原因是，每个人都知道1929年的股市崩盘，崩掉了股市90%的财富，这笔损失花了25年才勉强回本，所以没人敢在股市上投放太多。同时，债券的收益当时也相当可观，最高的时候达到了15%以上。客观的说，如果当时把资金100%投在30年国库券上，可以在下面的30年里坐享每年15%的利息，还是不错的。但是缺点是，这15%的利息拿到手之后，再也没有15%的债券让你投资了。而在股市上赚来的钱继续投在股市里，还可以取得类似的回报。从复利的角度来说，长期来看还是投在股市里面划算。
And there are basically three things that you can do to affect your returns. First of all, you can decide what assets you're going to have in the portfolio and in which proportions you'll hold those assets. So that's the asset allocation decision. So asset allocation is far and away the most important tool that we have available to us as investors. How much in domestic stocks, how much in foreign stocks, how much in real estate, if you're an institutional investor, how much in timber, how much in leveraged buyouts, how much in venture capital. The second thing that you can do is make a market timing decision. In the short run, you think that, let's say domestic stocks are expensive and foreign stocks are cheap. You decide to hold more foreign stocks and less in domestic stocks. That bet, that short-term bet against your long-term targets is a market timing decision. And the returns that are attributable to that deviation from your long-term targets are the returns that would be attributable to market timing. And the third source of returns has to do with security selection. You've got your allocation to domestic equities. If you buy the market, and the way that you buy the market is to buy an index fund that holds all of the securities in the market in the proportions that they exist in the market. If you buy the market, then your returns to security selection are zero because your portfolio is going to perform in line with the market. But if you make security selection bets, if you decide that you want to try and beat the market, or that series of bets will define your returns attributable to security selection. So if you decide that you think the prospects of Ford are superior to the prospects of GM, well, you want to overweight Ford and underweight GM, and if that turns out to be a good bet and you're rewarded because Ford outperforms and GM underperforms, then you have a positive return to security selection. If the converse is true, then you have a negative return to security selection. I could take Yale's $17 or $18 billion and put it all in Google stock. Now, if I did that, I'm not sure how long I'd keep my job. It might be fun for a while. But if I did that, asset allocation would have almost nothing to say about Yale's returns, right? It would be the idiosyncratic return associated with Google. And so security selection would be the overwhelming important determinant of returns for Yale's endowment. And if it wasn't exciting enough to sell everything and put it all in Google stock, maybe I could go back to my office and start day trading bond futures. If I took Yale's entire $17 or $18 billion and started trading bond futures with it, asset allocation would have very little to say about Yale's returns. Security selection would probably have very little to say about Yale's returns. It would all be about market timing ability. And if I'm great at following the trend is your friend. Of course, that's true until it's not. Or if I've got some sort of marvelous scheme to outsmart all the other smart people who are trading in the bond market, well, that could generate some nice returns, but those returns would have nothing to do with asset allocation, nothing to do with security selection, everything to do with market timing. Whether we're individual investors or institutional investors, we tend to have a sensible, stable approach to asset allocation. And within the asset allocation framework that we employ, we tend to hold well-diversified portfolios of securities within each of the asset classes. So that means that asset allocation is going to be the predominant determinant of returns. School of Management, Roger Ibbotson, came out with a finding that more than 90% of the variability of returns in institutional portfolios had to do with the asset allocation decision. In that same study, I thought that there was a more interesting conclusion, and that was that asset allocation actually determined more than 100% of investor returns. So if security selection and market timing are negative-sum games, then asset allocation would explain more than 100% of the returns because investors do engage in market timing, investors do engage in security selection. Those are going to be negative-sum games, and you have to subtract the leakages occurring because of security selection and market timing in order to get down to the returns that you would get if you just took your asset allocation targets and implemented them passively.
我们用他刚才说的这个投资框架来看方舟基金，就会看到虽然 Cathy Wood 把资产配置在科技股上面，但是他频繁的买进买出，有些重仓股的比重高达10%以上，有些时候高达10%以上。估计方舟基金的回报大约80%到85%，取决于资产配置，大约8%到12%取决于选股，大约5%到8%取决于买入卖出的时机。这是5月11日的早盘，各个微信群里当时都在喊崩盘了，快跑。
Don't worry about it. Don't panic. All you have to have is patience, do a little research. You've got it.
回到5月11日，虽然早盘非常吓人，但是开盘之后反而涨了。当然了，后来5月12日，因为巴勒斯坦向以色列发射了一些武器，这个股市又跌回去了。
Well, I had this perfect record. I think the 13 years I ran Magellan, the market went down 9 times, 10% or more. I had a perfect record. I went down more than the market. Every time I went down more. So I just didn't worry about it. the point is, when you say to yourself, do I need this money in a year? Do I need this money in 2 years? Do I need this money in 3 years? So my longer term stock market's been the best place to be last 10 years, last 30 years, last 130 years. But if you need the money in 1 or 2 years, you shouldn't be buying stocks. More people lost money waiting for corrections and anticipating corrections than the actual corrections. Well, you ought to look in the mirror every day and say, what am I going to do if the market goes down 10%? What do you do if it goes down 20? Am I going to sell? Am I going to get out? If that's your answer, you should be reducing it today.
他这句话其实很有道理，一直等着捞底的人，股市大跌的时候未必敢出手捞底，或者捞在半山腰之后，马上觉得自己错了，在底部割肉。想要长期赚钱，还是要做好资产配置，然后投入闲钱，关键还是闲这个字，闲钱才能让人有底气，不割肉。
Is a lot of times people buy on the basis the stock has gone down this much. How much further can it go down? I did the same thing in my, I think my first or second year at Fidelity. Kaiser Industries had gone from $26 a share to 16. I said, how much lower can it go? It's 16. So I think we bought one of the biggest blocks ever on the American Stock Exchange of Kaiser Industries at 14. I said, it's gone from 26 to 16. How much lower can it go? Well, at 10, I called my mother and said, Mom, you got to look at this Kaiser Industries. I mean, how much lower can it go? It's gone from 26 to 10. Well, it went to 6, it went to 5, it went to 4, it went to 3. And at 3, I figured out, there's something very wrong here because Kaiser Industries owns 40% of Kaiser Steel, they own 40% of Kaiser Aluminum, they own 32% of Kaiser Cement, they own Kaiser Broadcasting, they own Kaiser Sand and Gravel, Kaiser Engineers, they own Jeep, they own business after business, and they had no debt. Now, I learned this very early. This might be a breakthrough for some people. It's very hard to go bankrupt if you don't have any debt. But they had no debt, and the whole company at 3 was selling at about $75 million. I was a little premature at 16, but I said everything's fine, and eventually this will work out. And what they did is they gave away all their shares to their shareholders. They passed out shares in Kaiser Cement, they passed out shares in Kaiser Aluminum, they passed out their public shares in Kaiser Steel, they sold all the other businesses, and you get about $50 a share. But if you didn't understand the company, if you're just buying on the fact the stock had gone from 26 to 16, and then it went to 10, what would you do when it went to 9? What would you do when it went to 8? What would you do when it went to 7? This is the problem that people have. People saying it'll come back. Well, it doesn't have to come back. Here's another one you hear all the time. It's $3. How much can I lose? I've had people call me up saying, I'm thinking of buying the stock at 3. How much can I lose? Well, if you put $1 million on it, you can lose $1 million. And in fact, short sellers, people that really make money in stocks, they don't short Walmart, they don't short Home Depot, they don't short the great companies, Johnson & Johnson. They short stocks down from 80 to 7. They'd like to short it at 16 or 22, but they figured out at 7 that this company is going to go to 0. They just haven't blown taps on this thing yet. It's going to 0. And they're selling it short at 7, they're selling it short at 6, at 5, at 4, at 3, at 2, at 1 1/4. And to sell something short, you need a buyer. Somebody has to buy the damn thing. And you wonder, who's buying this thing? It's these people saying it's 3. How much lower can it go?
他刚才提到了做空，我们顺便来看一下做空 Tesla 的力量。Tesla 年初的时候，空方 short sell 了6000万股 Tesla。上个月空方也还是比较猖狂的 ，short sell 了5000多万股。到了4月底 ，Tesla 的股价已经从最高点跌了30%多，被做空的股票数量也减少到了4000多万股。德国工厂推迟6个月投产，中国最近有几起小事故和一件大车祸已经导致1人死亡。我暂时想不出来最近能有什么好消息，所以估计下面几个月都不一定能够大涨，就在550块钱到750块钱之间横盘。如果特斯拉股票跌到550块钱左右，有闲钱的人可以自己决定要不要买入。
9 times the market declined by 10% or more. All 9 times Magellan Fund fell 10% or more.
这段话我在这个视频里面故意放了2遍，就是为了说明，像 Peter Lynch 这样的绝顶高手，上前躲不过股市的大跌。咱们遇到大跌的时候，需要冷静。
Stock market, the most important organ is the stomach. It's not the brain. There's always, on the way to work, the amount of bad news you can hear is almost infinite now. So the question is, can you take that? I mean, do you really have faith that 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, common stocks are a place to be? If you believe in that, you should have some money in equity funds.
So for every dollar that you had at the peak, at the trough you had 10 cents left. Because if you put $1 into small stocks in June of 1932, by the end of 2006, you would have had 159,000 times your money.
You shouldn't be intimidated Everyone can do well in the stock market. You have the skills, you have the intelligence.
And if you've got a long time horizon, you should be rewarded by accepting equity risks, because those equity risks, even though they might not reward you in the short run, will reward you in the long run.